Hi, this is Tyrant from the First Virtual Fighter Wing, here with another video tutorial about WeatherGen. The features I want to talk about in this tutorial are the wind stability regions and the weather overrides. So these features are intended to let you override the randomly generated weather. The randomly generated weather is pretty convenient. Obviously we can click random and get an entirely different pattern. But there may be certain situations in which you want some more control over the weather than just picking a random pattern. For instance, two common scenarios are you want to be able to control the winds for either carrier operations or tanking, or you want to have certain conditions in the target area or on recovery, either so that the weather is good or the weather is bad, depending on what your objectives are. So if you're using random weather, obviously it's going to kind of evolve however it's going to evolve. As we move through time, you'll see that some of the large areas will fade out, others will fade in, etc., and so forth. But let's say that we have a tanker tasked, say somewhere over here, and we know that winds, varying winds, can interfere with tanking. Pretty much everything can interfere with tanking in BMS, but we can address this by using what's called a wind stability region. So here I'm going to click Add New, and what we're going to see is in the upper right hand corner here, there's sort of a dashed white and black border area. You can move that by adjusting the location here in the controls, just typing in like the upper left hand corner should be at cell 15, right, and that'll move it down. But by far the more convenient way to adjust this is with the edit button. If we click that, we'll be able to go in here and drag this. So we could go ahead and say, okay, I know my tanker track is it's oriented, say, east-west, and it's here, and it's about this long. And if I do that, you can see, in fact, maybe we need to zoom in a little bit here. You can now see that the wind in that area, these wind vectors, are showing all the same direction, and they're independent of the surrounding winds. This is a wind stability area. And you can move it around, put it wherever you want, resize it, and so forth. Now, the way that you set the speed and direction of the wind is you need to use the controls that we were looking at a minute ago. So let me make this smaller again so we can see everything all at once. And if we scroll down to the wind stability controls, in this area we can see that the wind is at 5 knots out of 45. We could adjust that to, say, be 15 knots at heading of 270. And if you can see, the wind is now coming out of the west. All right, so when we're done, we can go ahead and click that so that it is no longer editable. And that's pretty much it. You can set those up around tankers, around air bases. If you want to ensure a certain recovery runway, you can set the wind. And no matter what else happens with the weather, the wind will always be that speed within that wind stability region. The other thing that we can do in terms of overriding the randomly defaulted weather is this weather override regions. So we're going to click Add New there, and you'll see that we get this sort of pink circle on the map. And what's happening there is same thing. We can move it around and edit it, and it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. If I move it over here to this region of fair weather, when I drop it there, you'll notice that the weather gets worse. The reason is that we have overridden the pressure in that area to be 29 on the meter, 29 inches of mercury. And because the way WeatherGen works is that it effectively generates random pressure and then figures out what the weather should be from that. By overriding the pressure, we're overriding the type of weather that we're getting. So here we're using a fairly low pressure of 29 inches of mercury. If we set that to 31 inches of mercury, then what we would see is that we're overriding the weather in that area to be good weather, right? Sunny weather. So you can go either way. You can even set it in the middle. I guess I could see a reason you would want to do that. Maybe you want to have guarantee you have fair area so that people have to fair weather in a target area so that people have to work around the cumulus clouds. But generally speaking, the way I see most people use this is that they set it to low pressure. So we'll do the same for our example. Okay, so if you notice when I clicked edit, there are actually two circles here. What we have here is the radius is in the controls here. This radius is this big circle, so that's how many squares big it is. And then we have what's called a fall off. So the way this works is that the pressure inside the inner circle will always be exactly the pressure that you say. All right, so here we've said 29 inches of mercury. So all the pressure inside the inner circle will always be 29 inches, and therefore, you're guaranteed to have inclement weather. And then between the inner circle and the outer circle in the fall off region, it will gradually fade from whatever you've set as the override pressure to the surrounding weather. So if we kind of slide it over here, you'll see that it kind of merges this bad weather with whatever the surrounding weather. So here it kind of, faded into this area of non-overridden inclement weather. And that's just to keep from having like super abrupt transitions. Like you don't really want to have in BMS sunny weather directly next to inclement weather. It just the weather engine isn't really designed to handle that. So that's what that area between the two circles is meant to be, an area where we gradually blend into the surrounding generated weather. Okay, so there's another thing we can do here, aside from set the size and location, is we can either show the outline or not. That's pretty obvious. If I click that off, you'll see the pink circle goes away. But the other thing that we could do is we can say fade in and out. Now, if we say fade in out, what's going to happen is you're going to be able to schedule the arrival of that override. So right now, what it'll do is when you click fade in, it'll take the current time as sort of the starting time. So we've got 4 times here: begin, peak, taper, and end. The way this works is that before the beginning time, the weather will just be whatever it was going to be from the generated weather. So if we step back in time here, we will see, right now we're at 10 o'clock. We'll see that anytime before 10 o'clock, the weather override is not in effect. It's not doing anything. But if we go forward to 10 o'clock, starting from 10 o'clock, and I'm going to go ahead and make it go forward in just 15-minute intervals so we can see the change a little bit better. What will happen is that weather override will gradually fade in. So you can see the weather is getting worse and worse and worse until at the time labeled peak here, the weather override will be in full effect, meaning that inside the inner circle, the pressure will be exactly whatever we specified, and outside of it will gradually fade into the surrounding area. And then as we step forward in time again, it will continue to be fully in effect. It will be, totally overridden until the time we have specified as taper, which here is 1300. So at 1300, we will see the weather start to fade back to whatever it was going to be otherwise. So you can use, and then of course there's the end time at which is specified down here as 1400. The end time is 1400. So at 1400, the weather override is no longer in effect whatsoever. So you can use this to sort of have the weather be, for example, for the weather to be good at takeoff at a particular airbase, but then be bad when at recovery. So you could say, okay, there's a we're taking off at 10 o'clock. We're going to do a 2-hour mission. We're going to come back at at noon. So in this case, you take off an hour later. The weather will, at 11 o'clock, the weather will be bad, and it'll be bad until 1300. At which point it'll go back to whatever it was going to be. So that's kind of handy. In fact, we flew a mission last night in the first where the mission commander, the mission planner, did exactly that. Like we had an air base that we were returning to, and the forecast was, it looks pretty good right now. But when we got back, the weather had turned sour, and he did that, ensured that would happen by using a weather override region. There's one more box in here, which is exclude from forecast, which means, and if I click this, what will happen is, if you remember from our forecast video, you can get a forecast for an area. So if we click on someplace like this, and we have the exclude from forecast box checked, what will happen is that the weather override region will not be reflected in the forecast. So I need to go back to a time before the weather override is in effect so we can see it in the forecast. If I jump to there, so if we look here now, you can see that the forecast, even up through the time where we've got a weather override, is for fair weather, and that's because we've excluded it from the forecast. Now if I go down here and uncheck that, so what will happen there is it'll say, okay, this is not a surprise, right? Like this weather override is not meant to be a secret. It will be visible in the forecast, and that's so that when you're using the shareable forecast, which is covered in another tutorial, that you can either choose for your participants to either be aware of the override or not aware of the override. It lets you plan some surprises if you like. It's really up to you though which way you go. So that pretty much covers weather overrides and wind type, or rather wind stability regions. If you have any questions, as always, you can click on the help link right here in WeatherGen. That'll take you to the BMS forum where WeatherGen is announced and where you can ask questions. Thanks.